everyone, I'm back again with another tech video. Today I'm going to be talking to you about derailleur adjustments. So to start out, I'm going to be talking about rear derailleurs with this bike here. I'm going to switch to another bike with front derailleurs, seeing as this bike here does not have one. Basically, what we're looking at for the adjustment of the rear derailleur, what I'm talking about here is right in this area here. So our derailleur is basically our transmission. We're looking at the connection between our derailleur in the back, and the cable all the way up to the to our shifter in the front. So that's what we're going to be looking at for adjustment. When we're talking about rear derailleurs, we've got a few different things that we can adjust on them. First off is going to be our cable tension, which is the most basic aspect. So that's basically going to be when we shift our gear, when we change gears, how much movement we're going to get out of that derailleur per gear change. So that's the type of thing you want to have just the right amount of cable tension, not too much, not too little, so that your derailleur goes to the right spot between gear changes. Next, we're going to have the B-screw, which that is basically just going to control the distance of our bottom jockey wheel here, the distance from that jockey wheel to our cassette, essentially. So that's the type of thing we want to have it very close. But not rubbing. So that's basically your guideline there. It's pretty simple. I mean, you'll know right away if there's any contact, you're going to hear a vibration. It's going to be very obvious. And if it's too far away, essentially what you're going to see is you might have a little bit of lag when you're changing gears. So you want to have it as close as you can get it without it actually rubbing and having this vibration. Next, we're going to have our stoppers. So we're going to have a high and a low. The high is going to be for high speed. The low is going to be for low speed. So the low is going to control, basically, I mean, a stopper is exactly what it sounds like. It stops the movement of the derailleur. It prevents the derailleur from going too far from one direction or the other. So our low speed stopper is going to be probably the most important adjustment that we're going to have on a rear derailleur, because that's what's stopping your derailleur from going too far towards the spokes. And that's what's going to stop your chain essentially from coming off your top cassette, your top gear on your cassette here, and going into the spokes and damaging things. I mean, I've seen derailleurs get ripped off when that happens. I've seen spokes damaged. I've seen chains broken. It's not fun when that happens, especially if you're either going. Most of the time when it's going to happen, it's not going to be when you're going downhill unless you're really cranking. That does happen when you're going downhill. It's not going to be fun. But generally speaking, it's the type of thing that we'll see more going uphill. The high is going to be basically, that's going to be on our small cassette. So that's going to prevent the chain from popping off on the outside of our cassette. So those are probably the most important adjustments on it, just because those are what are going to keep the chain on track and keep from creating damage elsewhere. After that, the cable tension, that's going to be how the derailleur is aligning with each individual gear on the cassette. And the B screw again is just the distance between our jockey wheel, our top jockey wheel, and the teeth of the cassette. The other adjustment that we have, which I'm not going to show you in the video, a little bit more complex and it requires a special tool which I don't have on hand here. That's the alignment of our derailleur hanger. So the derailleur hanger on most modern bikes is a separate piece, softer metal than the frame, basically, and what it is there for is it's essentially acts kind of like an electrical fuse. So instead of, if we're gonna bend, if let's say there's an impact on the derailleur and it's gonna bend, the idea is that it's gonna bend this piece of metal and not the frame. Especially when we're talking about aluminum, aluminum tends to be a little bit brittle. If we bend it one way, it might bend, it might crack right away, but chances are if you try and bring it back, it's gonna snap. Steel is a little bit more malleable, a little bit easier. But with aluminum or carbon fiber, of course, we have this derailleur hanger that comes into play here, and that's basically just going to act. It's going to break instead of breaking the frame. All right, so I'll show you what the different screws are that I was talking about. So when I'm talking about the B screw is going to be the one right here. So that's the one that's going to control the distance from the jockey wheel. And then the stoppers, let me get that cable out of the way. The stoppers are the two right there. Which one is going to be which? In this case, my high is going to be the one on the top, the one up here, and my low is going to be the one below. But that can change generally from one bike to the next. A lot of the time it's actually going to be written what is which one is which. Otherwise, the way to know is if you put your derailleur onto the smallest gear, one of those screws should be in contact just underneath, and the other one should not be in contact. And that'll let you know which one is which. When you're in your smaller gear, the screw that's in contact is going to be your high stopper, your high speed. And if you're on your biggest gear, that's the one that's going to be your low speed. Alright, and last but not least, the derailleur hanger, which I was talking about, is this piece just here, which is connecting the derailleur to the frame. Alright, so next, what we're going to need for this job is very simple. I'm starting out basically as if I'm resetting the tension on my cable completely. So I've completely taken the cable out. So for that, to tighten my cable retainer down, I'm just going to need an Allen key. For my case, it's just a little 5mm. Most of the time it's going to be a 5mm. Some older bikes will see a 9mm hex bolt, and other times we may see a 4mm. But you'll figure that out quickly enough. We're going to need a little Phillips screwdriver to adjust our B and our stoppers. And you might want to have a little bit of tri-flow on hand, just in case you're getting a little bit of lag in the movement. A little bit of tri-flow on your pivot points on the derailleur can go along with that. So, since I've got my cable disembarked, the first thing you always want to do when you're in that situation is make sure that your shifter is in the position to be on your lowest gear in the back. So the smallest chain wheel in the back. The way to do that basically is you want to pull lightly on the cable, and you can just try and shift into that position. If there's no movement, that's where you're going to be. The next thing you want to do is you want to take what we call our barrel adjuster, which is just on the shifter here, and that you want to make sure that it's all the way in. So you want to bring it all the way in, which I've done already. Then you just want to bring it out about a full turn. The reason we do that is basically so that if we put too much tension on the cable by hand, we can back off our barrel adjuster and reduce the tension and give it the proper tension. And again, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. Our barrel adjuster here, this is what we're going to use to add or remove tension. Basically, if we unscrew it, it's going to move away from the shifter itself, in this case, and that's going to add tension on the cable. A lot of the time, bikes are going to have one on the shifter and one on the derailleur. Some do, some don't. Some will only have it on the derailleur in the term of a road bike. For most mountain bikes, you'll either see just on the shifter or both. And same thing for a front derailleur. Your barrel adjuster is always going to be either on the shifter or it'll be somewhere else attached to the frame in line with the cable. So first thing I want to do, now that I've got my barrel adjuster set up properly, first thing I want to do is I want to attach my cable. And this is one thing that is important to make sure that you're following the correct cable routing. And you'll see a lot of the time there's going to be a little notch on the derailleur, and it's going to be pretty obvious. That's where you want to put your cable. And you want to put a fair amount of hand tension on it. You don't want to be pulling on it to the extent that you're moving the derailleur, but you definitely want to get it nice and a little bit of tension on that cable by hand as much as possible. Tighten that down. And then we can see where we're at. So I just want to cycle through my gears. I'm going up. And I got that pretty close to perfect just by hand there. Or a little bit. Alright, so next step what I'm going to do is basically the first thing I want to do at this one is I want to put it right to the top, so on my biggest cassette, on my biggest chain wheel in the back, and I want to make sure that my stopper is working properly. The way to test that basically is you put it onto your top chain wheel and you want to go slowly, so I'll always stop my wheel from spinning before I do this test, and then basically I'm just going to go put my index finger or my middle finger on the top, and I just want to try and push my derailleur into the spokes essentially. So I want to try and make that chain come off inside the spokes. That doesn't do it. Right now it's adjusted properly, so it's staying where it should be. Now I'll just loosen it off and show you what happens basically if we are too loose. I'll get a couple turns there, and I'll do the same thing. And now my chain has popped off into my spokes. So I mean, that can happen fairly often, especially if you're working on a bike that hasn't had a tune-up in a little while. That is definitely a possibility. So now I'll pull it back on, and that's why you see why I go slowly when I'm doing that test, is because that chain could come off. It is definitely a possibility in that motion. The reason why I picked this bike out of the ones I have is this. Alright, so now what I'll do is I'll show you what happens if the stopper is too tight. Which isn't quite as dramatic of a consequence, but can give you a little bit of a limitation. So now I want to go up onto my, I didn't tighten it enough. I'll give that a little bit, tighten it a little bit more. So see, as I tighten it, eventually my chain will change down onto the next gear. See now, I should be on my top gear right now, and then just pop down onto the second one. So that's my stopper that's just preventing my derailleur from going far enough for my chain to get onto my low speed, my big chain wheel on the cassette. So now I'm just going to set that up properly. And like I said, that's one of the most important adjustments that you can do on a bicycle. Basically, this one has the internal clutch mechanism that Shimano is a fan of. This can be turned on or off just by this switch right here. And essentially what it does is it prevents the swing arm of the derailleur from bouncing around. So it reduces your chain slap as you're going over bumps. So right now it's not engaged, and you can see the movement that I'm getting just from the derailleur. Once I engage it, that movement goes down quite a bit. There's still a little bit, not anywhere near as much. When you're starting off to do your adjustments, I generally like to take it off. But then once I'm going to do my fine tune, I definitely want to have that on, because I'm going to be riding with that on. So we want to have it adjusted accordingly. Alright, so my stopper is good. I want to check my high-speed stopper. And there's two ways we can do that. One is when you have the cable disconnected, you can just see how far the derailleur is going to come back. Tighten your stopper until the chain is staying on the wheel. The other way we can do it is we can tighten it to the point where it shifts up to the next gear. And then bring it back. Now as I tighten it, see there, it just changed up. Now so I'm going to unscrew it slowly. And you want to do small movements with this, because a quarter of a turn can make a big difference in the position of the derailleur. That is good. What I want to do is I want to take a look at my B-screw. And I'll show you what I mean by the distance. So you might not be able to see super great, but right now I've got maybe about a centimeter between tooth on my jockey wheel and the tooth on, maybe a little bit more than a centimeter from the tooth on my jockey wheel to the tooth on my cassette. If I were to loosen my B screw, my jockey wheel is going to approach the cassette more and more. So there I loosened it a couple of turns. Well, I'm not quite at the vibration point yet, but we're getting there. I'll loosen it some more. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to really hear it, but the vibration is picking up more and more. The more I loosen it, the more contact there's going to be. And now there's really a definitive vibration. So that's actually the teeth of my jocular and the teeth of my cassette are actually making contact in this instance. That's something we really want to avoid. So now I'm just going to tighten the screw. The more I tighten it, the more my jocular is going to come back. Move away from the cassette. Go a little tiny bit more. Yeah, so now I got a little bit less of this anyway. I'm gonna go a little bit more. There we go. So that should be good like that. So again, about somewhere between half to a centimeter type deal of distance. That's generally speaking going to be good. But like I said, you'll definitely know when there's being contact made. You're going to feel the vibration very obvious. It's a little bit more difficult when it's too far away, but you might notice a little bit of a lag in the changing of gears. Basically, the reason that is because the further away that jockey wheel is going to be from our cassette, the more length of chain is going to be in between the jockey wheel and the cassette. So that's going to be just more room to maneuver before we have a definitive change of gears, essentially. So there's going to be more torsion in the chain before the chain is pulled from one gear to the next. So now that I've got my B screw set up, I've got my stoppers set up. Next thing I want to do is my cable tension, and for that I'm going to start off on my smallest chain ring, and I'm going to shift up once like that. So that's good. Go on to the next one. Go to the next one. Next one's good. And now I think I'm catching. Yeah, I'm catching a little bit on the next one up. So the next bigger chain wheel. So that what I want to do there is I want to take off a little bit of tension. So I'm just going to screw in my barrel adjuster. Just a quarter turn. Almost there. A little bit more. And I'm going to check all my gears. Alright. So now we're good. I'm just going to show you real quick what's going to happen, let's say, if I put way too much tension on it. So I'll crank it a few turns. And you see as I'm turning it, my chain pops up to the next speed. So I'll go back down just to get it at the right spot. Check once more. So anytime you're verifying the adjustments that you've just made on your cable tension, you always want to cycle through each gear. The reason for that being is the tension is going to be not necessarily 100% accurate between each. So I mean, you might have enough tension to go from the small one to the next fairly easily. That might actually be either a little bit too much or a little bit not enough to go from the higher one, from the ones that are a little bit larger. So we want to check on each gear, make sure that we have that tension just right. And it definitely is. It's the type of thing that can take a little bit of practice to get used to at the beginning. It's definitely easy to go a little bit too far or a little bit not enough. So that's why I always suggest, especially when you're starting out, to do small movements. Check, do another small movement. You'll see it as it gets better and better. That's the best way to go about it. So next, since I've got a clutch on here, this is one thing that I want to make sure that it's working properly with that clutch engaged, because when I'm riding the bike, that clutch is supposed to be engaged. So I'm going to go and cycle through once more. Check my low speed stopper. Good. The stopper shouldn't really change between between having the clutch engaged or disengaged, but as I like to stress, it is probably one of the most important points of adjustment, maybe on the whole bike, just because if you're going up a hill mountain biking, if you're really cranking on your pedals and that chain gets into your spokes, you're going to have a bunch of spokes that are going to need being replaced. You're probably going to have a chain that's going to need being replaced. You might even have a cassette that needs being replaced, and if you're really unlucky, you might have a derailleur that needs being replaced as well. That is, I dare say, perfect. So that's good for my rear derailleur. For most other derailleurs, I mean, that don't have the clutch, it's pretty simple. I mean, you just skip the step of putting the clutch on or off. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. They don't have a clutch, so you can't do anything with it. With these clutches, there is an adjustment. So that clutch can be too tight or too loose. Too loose can affect essentially you'll have a little excess chain slap as you're riding. If it's too tight, that could actually affect your shifting smoothness. I will probably do another video later on about how to adjust that. So it's probably maybe a little bit more complicated in the scope of this video, but I'll probably do one later on about that. One thing we want to watch out for, a couple things we want to watch out for actually, in terms of whether we want to replace or do we want to adjust. One thing is going to be our chain wear. So chain wear is super important to keep an eye on. A chain that is worn out is basically going to not shift as well. And basically what happens is we'll just have the links the metal's going to wear down on the links. That's going to create a bit more of a gap between them, and it's going to create space. So effectively your chain is actually kind of stretching in length. So it's not going to shift as well, because it's not going to be aligning with the gears of the cassette as well either. Same thing if we've got a worn cassette. That's the type of thing that could influence our shifting. It might not be popping into place properly, so you might have a chain that's skipping type thing. Also, one of the most common things that we'll see are going to be either our derailleur hanger that's bent. That can be brought back into place. It is possible that it breaks just because we are bending metal at that point. And the other thing that we see a lot of the time is a worn cable. So worn cable and cable housing, that can basically just create enough resistance that the spring in your derailleur is no longer strong enough to bring the derailleur back. So what we'll see there is basically if we're going from a big gear to a smaller one, in terms of teeth quantity, what we're going to see is it's going to get to the right spot, but there's going to be a delay. So it's going to kind of like lag, essentially. So yeah, there's going to be a bit of a lag. That's basically what we're going to want to do is just change the cable. There's not really a way around that. You can try and lubricate a little bit. Tri-flow is actually good for that. You can also try to lubricate the pivot points because that could be influencing it as well. But generally speaking, if we're shifting properly all the way up, and then when you're going from big to small, and it's just slow shifting, so it gets to the right spot, but it takes a little bit more time, that's where I'm probably going to say that it's just a question of a worn cable and cable housing. Time to replace those. One more thing will be our jockey wheels here. So jockey wheels is basically, you have two types. You have some that'll actually have a bearing in them. Most of the time it's probably just going to be a bushing. These will wear out. That's the type of thing. You can look at the wear on the teeth itself, but your best indicator is basically if there's a lot of play, excessive play on the jockey wheel, time to replace it. That'll be about it for the video today. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any comments, leave them in the comments section below. Have a great day.
Bye.